It's 8 a.m. in Tokyo. The world's second largest economy stirs to life. A flood of salaried workers rush to their jobs, ready today again to give their all to their employers, Japan's giant corporations. The Japanese are famous for their hard work and dedication. Half a century ago, however, this dedication was harnessed for the pursuit of war and conquest. In those days, ordinary people were exploited to serve the interests of a handful of leaders: the militarists, bureaucrats, and the rich. To realize the ambition of the elite, the poor were sent off to the battlegrounds. Even religion was enlisted in the war effort, used to convince people that Japan's overseas aggression was really a holy war. After the defeat, the victorious Americans imposed a foreign ideology, democracy, on this ancient feudal society. If democracy was unfamiliar to the Japanese people 50 years ago, some question how well it has taken root in Japan since then. Historically, any movement in Japan that attempted to empower individuals met with enormous resistance. However, one populist movement, the Soka Gakkai, violently suppressed during World War II, has since managed to survive and grow in a sometimes hostile environment. Claiming its roots in 13th century Buddhist tradition, the Soka Gakkai has undergone phases of persecution, reconstruction, and development, led by a succession of charismatic individuals. This is the story of modern Japan, seen through the lens of Japan's most controversial religious movement, the Soka Gakkai. No country brings the ancient and the modern together quite like Japan. The country's largest religious movement, the Soka Gakkai, is no exception. While drawing on a form of 13th century Buddhism, it is thoroughly modern in all other ways. Its more than 10 million practitioners do not meditate in quiet mountain retreats, but are actively engaged in all aspects of society, including politics. This engagement stirs controversy. In Japan, a country famous for preferring the soft gray center of compromise, opinions on the Soka Gakkai are sharply split. Critics say that it is a sinister movement with designs to dominate the country or even the world. Its followers claim to be working to empower their fellow citizens. How has Japanese society responded to the growth of what today is Japan's largest grassroots people's movement? Why do its leaders continue to attract so much controversy? Answers to these questions may be found in a history that reaches back to 13th century Japan and the life of the Buddhist monk Nichiren. This is Kamakura, Japan, a tourist destination resplendent with Buddhist temples and popular beaches. But unknown to most visitors, beneath the veneer of modern Kamakura lies a dark and turbulent history. Hiro Sato, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Tohoku University, is one of Japan's top scholars of Kamakura Buddhism.
Today, the beaches of Kamakura are crowded with surfers. In those days, they were littered with corpses.
The 13th century was a time of unusual hardship in Kamakura. Floods, droughts, famine, and plague ravaged the populace. Ruthless warrior clans had seized control from the emperor and made Kamakura their capital. Conditions were so harsh that 10% of the population could die off in a matter of months, while the rulers watched indifferently. Bodies were left to rot on the beach like piles of discarded trash. In response to the crisis facing the nation, new schools of Buddhism emerged. But as soon as these schools became established, they began to pander to the interests of the authorities, praying for the prosperity of these warrior rulers, receiving protection and patronage in return.
When disasters struck and the crops failed, there would be a struggle over how to distribute what little there was. Those in the lowest social classes were the last to get the food and the first to starve.
Promoting a popular teaching which promised salvation in the afterlife, Kamakura priests lulled commoners into a sleepy acceptance of suffering and death. In this rigid feudalistic age, one monk, Nichiren, dared to defy state and religious authority. Nichiren was born in 1222 to a family of poor fishermen. While young, Nichiren traveled to the major Buddhist temples in Japan, studying every sutra expounded by the Buddha, searching for a remedy for the suffering and chaos that surrounded him. Wherever he went, he found corrupted temples filled with obsequious priests, eager to appease those in power and enjoying comfortable lives, while the commoners suffered.
Before Nichiren, it was thought that the role of Buddhism was to pray for the protection and prosperity of those in power, the emperor or the shogun. Nichiren insisted that the purpose of Buddhism was to protect the lives of ordinary people.
Nichiren's antidote for the people's misery was the message of the Buddhist scripture of the Lotus Sutra, which asserts the equality of all people, regardless of social status or wealth. But to realize the message of the Lotus Sutra, Nichiren would have to confront the authorities. In 1260, he wrote a petition to the most powerful leader in the country, condemning the government's irresponsibility. Rulers, he asserted, exist only to serve the people.
The monks and priests today are fawning and devious, and they confuse the people and lead them astray. The ruler and his ministers lack understanding and fail to distinguish between truth and heresy.
The rulers' response was swift and violent. They would not tolerate any challenge to their authority. Nichiren soon found himself facing the full weight of the military government.
I don't think anyone in the history of Japanese Buddhism faced as many persecutions as Nichiren. First, his home was set on fire. Then he was banished from Kamakura. Hostile samurais ambushed and killed several of his followers. Nichiren was wounded, but escaped death. Returning to Kamakura, he sent 11 more letters of protest to the leaders. The government was determined to behead him, but failed. Then, he was exiled to Sato, a distant, snowbound island from which no one was expected to return alive.
Eventually, Nichiren was released, the government offering him a temple of his own in exchange for his silence. Nichiren refused, choosing instead to set down his teachings in writing for the future generations. Japan's leaders remained fixed and unchanged. And 7 centuries would pass until the spirit of his teachings would be revived on the eve of Japan's darkest hour. Decades before the outbreak of the Second World War, Japan initiated a policy of aggressive expansion in Asia. Military conquest was seen as a means for gaining respect from Western nations and yielded important raw materials necessary for further expansion. This aggression was executed by military warlords with the support of politicians and the nation's wealthy elite. The relationship between those in power and the ordinary citizens of Japan remained largely unchanged since the feudal days of Nichiren. While Japan's elite enjoyed the spoils of war, the poor were sent off to the dangerous work of foreign conquest and occupation. But to enforce unconditional support at home for these imperial ambitions abroad, the Japanese leaders used every possible means to ensure compliance from the people. An emperor-centered state religion, Shrine Shinto, was employed to accomplish this goal.
Shrine Shinto was a religion of nationalism, which involved state worship. The Japanese political leadership, they used Shrine Shintoism to garner popular support to the government's activities. Part and parcel with that is the role of the emperor as the head of this Shrine Shinto.
One special target for indoctrination were those who were the most impressionable, Japanese school children. Shinto worship and compulsory military training were introduced to students at a young age. But these practices were not without their critics. One of them was a school teacher named Tsunisaburo Makiguchi, a man who would eventually revive the reformist movement of Nichiren Buddhism. Makiguchi, an early advocate of educational reform, questioned Japan's ultra-nationalist agenda. He sharply criticized the school system that placed the needs of the state before the needs of ordinary people. Yasu Kashiwabara was a school teacher together with Makiguchi.
Because Japan was controlled by the militarists, our education system was geared toward creating soldiers. However, Mr. Makiguchi insisted that the purpose of education is the lifelong happiness and security of the individual.
Makiguchi grew up in extreme poverty. From early in his career, he was an outsider, a critical voice. He boldly called for abolishing the system of strict government control of education. As a result of his radical views, Makiguchi was driven from one school to the next. But wherever he went, Makiguchi continued to challenge the status quo with a philosophy of compassion.
What then is the purpose of national education? Rather than devise complex theories, isn't it better to look to the lovely child who sits on your knee and ask yourself, what can I do to assure that this child will be able to lead the happiest life possible?
For 6 years, from 1st through 6th grade, Tomoya Warashina was a student of Makiguchi.
When I was in 5th grade, all the students were gathered to the school auditorium where Mr. Makiguchi lectured us on peace.
At the time, each student was required by the government to recite what was, in effect, a pledge of allegiance to the emperor.
The Pledge of Allegiance stated something like this: if war should occur, selflessly sacrifice everything. Offer yourself courageously to the state. This concept was totally contrary to Mr. Makiguchi's views. He said what is more important is to prevent war. That should be our objective, not to think about what to do if war occurred. I remember being so excited about becoming someone who would work for peace. But as you know, we did plunge into war.
While Japan's armies were committing atrocities abroad, at home, the government launched an intensive campaign to mobilize the public to support the war. Makiguchi realized he needed a stronger vehicle for social reform. He found it in Nichiren Buddhism.
Nichiren was known as a person who bravely challenged the authorities of his time. So Makiguchi naturally saw Nichiren as a model for resisting the government.
Makiguchi would challenge the government, but not merely through protest. Seeking to have long-term impact, he formed an association of educators committed to social reform. He named the organization the Soka Gakkai, or Society for Value-Creating Education. Assisted by fellow teacher Josei Toda, Makiguchi sought to create lasting change through education and propagating the principles of Nichiren's Buddhism. But as time went on, Makiguchi took the perilous course of making increasingly defiant public statements. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor marked the start of a full-scale war in the Pacific. Makiguchi chose this moment to speak out.
We must strictly avoid following ideologies that sacrifice the precious life of the entire community, the lives of ourselves and others. It is urgent that we rethink the practice of mandatory worship at Shinto shrines.
But this was a risky move. Those who dared to speak out against the state were hauled off to jail.
If you were suspected of being defiant of the state, if you disobeyed official policy, you would be subject to severe oppression.
That was a risk Makiguchi was willing to take. With an escalating sense of urgency, Makiguchi crisscrossed Japan, conducting hundreds of discussion meetings with local citizens. At these gatherings, Makiguchi criticized the ongoing war as a national disaster.
Mr. Makiguchi would say, "It's absurd. How could Japan win a war against America?"
But Makiguchi was being watched. Members of the Special Higher Police, the Japanese equivalent of the Nazi Gestapo, were dispatched to attend Makiguchi's meetings.
When the discussion turned to state Shintoism, the members of the Special Police immediately stopped us. They forced the meetings to break up.
Anyone considered to be anti-nationalist would be arrested and imprisoned.
In July of 1943, Makiguchi and his protege, Josei Toda, were arrested, charged with denying the divinity of the emperor. In November of 1944, Allied bombing of Tokyo began. The tide of war had turned. That month, unbending to the end, Makiguchi died in prison. In August of the following year, the war was brought to an end by a weapon more destructive than any the world had ever seen. Josei Toda, Makiguchi's trusted protege, was released from prison and into the wasteland of a conquered nation. Ravaged by malnutrition and barely able to walk, he confronted for the first time the utter destruction that the war had wrought. Misery and despair hung in the air like a thick fog. Makiguchi was dead, the Soka Kyoiku Gakkai had been destroyed. Penniless and alone, Toda seemed as doomed as any of the powerless millions around him. But Toda was burning with profound resolve. While in prison, the news of Makiguchi's death had cast Toda into a pit of bitter grief. But there, in the midst of his despair, he had vowed that he would not let Makiguchi's death be in vain. He would realize his mentor's dream to create a world in which ordinary people are no longer the helpless victims of war and oppression. And Josei Toda would have some help.
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Following Japan's surrender, Allied occupation began under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur, who was given a mandate to democratize Japan. A new and progressive peace constitution was introduced. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion were established by law. At first, these new values only added to the confusion of the post-war turmoil. Democracy was as foreign to the Japanese as Buddhism was to the American GI. Toda, however, understood the new possibilities that these freedoms presented. He could now begin the task of rebuilding the Soka Kyoiko Gakkai without the threat of imprisonment. He began to organize small-scale meetings where he lectured on Nichiren's philosophy. The people who were attracted to these meetings were desperately poor, struggling to rebuild their lives.
The Japanese people lost everything. For the first time, they had to confront the question of their very survival. Toda gave them a philosophy, a means to change their lives.
Never passively accept suffering as your destiny. We alone are responsible for the direction of our own lives. Every person has the right to become happy.
His down-to-earth manner, his infectious humor, his unshakable confidence in the power of each person to transform even the most dire circumstances, these held enormous appeal for his audience. Toda renamed the organization the Soka Gakkai, or Value-Creating Society. Cynics mockingly dubbed it a gathering of the poor and the sick. The organization expanded rapidly. Within a few years, the membership had increased to 5,000. But Toda was concerned about the political situation within Japan. He realized that beneath the thin veneer of a new democracy, the structures of power remained largely unchanged.
The post-war political establishment of Japan was dominated by the Conservative Party that represented big business, and the Socialist Party that represented the big labor unions. The people excluded from the system were the ordinary citizens.
The post-war system had failed to give birth to a party that would represent the voices of the ordinary people who had suffered the most. In 1956, Toda made the decision to expand his efforts for reform into the political realm by fielding political candidates from Soka Gakkai. Toda understood well the risk of directly confronting the political establishment. As he expected, this move was met with an immediate reaction by those who it most threatened. This marked the beginning of a history of organized campaigns to discredit the movement and contain its influence. The first of these confrontations occurred in 1957 in the coal mining town of Yubari. The town was dominated by the coal miners' union. Membership in the union was required to work in the mines. Because the mines were the region's only source of employment, this gave the union considerable power over the workers. Nationally, the union had strong ties to established parties and was one of the most powerful political forces in Japan. That year, in a stunning reversal, the candidate supported by the Soka Gakkai won more votes than the union-backed candidate. The union leadership was outraged. Fearing the loss of its influence, it began harassing the Soka Gakkai members in its ranks, threatening them with expulsion and thus the loss of their livelihoods. They initiated a smear campaign, using the media to stir up mistrust of Soka Gakkai members. The union made it clear that it was not the members' behavior, but their religious affiliation that was the issue. When Toda learned of these events, he dispatched the young Daisaku Ikeda to Yubari. Ikeda had joined the Soka Gakkai as a teenager in 1947 after attending a lecture given by Toda.
Because he had been jailed for opposing the war, I knew I could trust him. He spoke in universal terms, not about dogma. I knew I had met someone who could answer my questions, someone who could fill the spiritual void in my young heart. I decided to follow him and to learn from him.
Ikeda threw all his energy into helping Toda rebuild the Soka Gakkai. Toda quickly recognized the young man's potential and regularly assigned him the most challenging tasks. It was to him that Toda would finally entrust the organization's future. When Ikeda arrived in Yubari, he immediately began to rally and encourage the members there. Under his leadership, the Soka Gakkai miners and their families found the courage to stand up to the overwhelming power of the Union. They insisted on their right, guaranteed by the post-war Constitution, to practice the faith of their choosing. Faced with a group of ordinary people willing to risk everything for their rights, the Union had no choice but to back down. This was an important victory for the emerging movement and for the 29-year-old Ikeda. For him, however, this was only the beginning of a history of confrontation with authority. Immediately after the coal miners' dispute, Ikeda was summoned by the police to the city of Osaka to respond to charges of election fraud. He was arrested and interrogated. The police confronted him with an ultimatum: confess, or we will arrest Toda. At this point, Toda's health was rapidly deteriorating. Ikeda knew that his mentor would probably not survive a second imprisonment. Soka Gakkai members organized a mass rally to protest Ikeda's innocence. He was released 2 weeks later, but the trial dragged on for 5 years before Ikeda was finally cleared of all charges. In April 1958, Josei Toda died. In the 13 years since he had been released from prison, he had made Nichiren Buddhism a living reality for more than 750,000 people. For them, his death was devastating. With Toda gone, critics and the media predicted that the Soka Gakkai would collapse. The organization's leaders, desperate to fill the void, began urging the young Ikeda to assume the presidency. Having worked closely with Toda, Ikeda knew firsthand the enormous pressures and stress that this would entail. His diary recalls his emotions at that time.
The stormy winds of my destiny are raging in my heart. I am 32, too young. Though I have declined several times, I may have no choice but to accept this great responsibility.
In May 1960, Ikeda assumed the presidency.
Although I am still young, from today, as a disciple of Mr. Toda, I am resolved to take the lead and advance our movement a step forward.
As president, he traveled ceaselessly throughout Japan in a frantic effort to sustain and move the organization forward. More than preventing its collapse, Ikeda breathed new life into the movement, energizing increasing numbers of ordinary Japanese citizens. Within a few years, the Soka Gakkai had grown into a major grassroots movement of more than 3 million members.
Buddhism is humanism. Everything begins and ends with the human being. Buddhism exists for the sake of humanity. If this is indeed an age of democracy, then the people themselves must assume center stage. They are sovereign, and those in power, the government, the strata of leadership, they all exist to serve the people. Unless we see things this way, humankind may never achieve ideal happiness, peace, and freedom.
The Soka Gakkai continued to grow. Today, 70 years after its founding, it is said that almost 1 in 10 Japanese citizens is a Soka Gakkai member.
In an essentially non-democratic Japan, ordinary people cowered before those in power. After they joined the Soka Gakkai, these ordinary people became empowered. And when they began to voice their opinions proudly, the relationships they had with others became democratic.
In Japan, those who are not representing the majority view are suspect of being non-Japanese. And that's very bad, not to be Japanese. If you want not to be discriminated, you should be part of the majority. But in the case of Soka Gakkai, it was based on a belief that Japan could and should become a better society. So this is where the Soka Gakkai played a very interesting role in representing the people, not in a conformistic way, but proposing something different, a kind of alternative Japan.
Soka Gakkai's message seems to have appealed to people from all walks of Japanese society. Osamu Kobayashi is a farmer in rural Japan. In an increasingly urbanized society, small-time farmers are struggling to maintain their livelihoods. Kobayashi says, Soka Gakkai offered me a new outlook on life.
I believe there is no life without obstacles. Overcoming deadlock. That's what life is all about.
Kobayashi has also had to work hard to overcome the prejudice that arose from his decision to join the Soka Gakkai.
I had many friends, but they all left me the moment I began to practice with the Soka Gakkai. But now, they respect me for not giving up.
Today, Kobayashi is recognized as a leader in his community. One of his initiatives has been to form a direct sales produce market, which has enabled the aging farmers of the district to maintain their livelihoods.
Years ago, I went to a Soka Gakkai meeting where President Ikeda was speaking. His message was, "Be the lighthouse of the community." Those words left a deep impression on me and have become my motto.
Ameyoko is a bustling outdoor market in downtown Tokyo. Small shop owners like these have been hit hard by Japan's longest post-war recession. Many have been forced out of business and into the growing ranks of the unemployed. Katsuhisa Shimura is a shop owner who sells chocolates and is well known for his bargain prices.
When a customer says, "Wow, this is wonderful, there's so much chocolate," that's a great feeling. With big supermarkets opening up, more and more shops like ours are forced to close down. I really wanted to create the kind of shop that would attract customers to this market.
Because of his lively sales method, Shimura has been featured on television a number of times. His fellow shop owners are pleased with this publicity, which has indeed drawn numerous new customers to the market.
If I'd not been practicing Buddhism, I probably would have only been concerned with making money. Nichiren Buddhism teaches that if you light a lantern for another, it will also brighten your way.
Tamio Kondo is a member of one of Japan's least visible minorities. For her, empowerment has meant rediscovering dignity.
Because Japanese society still does not accept open homosexuals, I know many gay people, especially salaried workers, who become very depressed and even consider suicide. I tell them, don't even think about it. You have to live true to yourself. It's your life. Whatever people may think, you are the one who is responsible for your happiness. If it wasn't for Buddhism, I would have lived the life of escapism, avoiding reality, and preferring to live in the shadows. But right now, I'm really happy.
Women in Japan are another group of people who have traditionally been silenced. Before World War II, Japanese women were second-class citizens, completely shut out of the political process. Tsuruku Oya owns a local eatery that is a neighborhood hangout in downtown Tokyo.
If I hadn't been a Soka Gakkai member, I wouldn't know the first thing about politics, about any political parties at all. Because of Soka Gakkai, I approach politics more easily. It's closer to me. I get enthusiastic about the issues.
In fact, the women members of the Soka Gakkai are said to be the most politically involved and active. This activism has not gone unnoticed.
Soka Gakkai directly expressed the voices of the people. This threatened the established powers. All-out efforts were made to discredit them. Since the end of the war, the establishment and the media incessantly criticized the Soka Gakkai, page after page of accusations, without factual basis or content. The Japanese public is constantly exposed to the headlines on the hanging ads in the trains and the subways. Seeing these is different from reading a serious article. Even if you don't read them, but just kind of notice the slander and gossip day after day, a negative image begins to develop and grow, and you start to become suspicious.
Soka Gakkai. I don't like them.
I don't like them.
I don't like them.
I really don't like them.
They should be outlawed. Soka Gakkai? Without a doubt, they're pathetic. The majority of the Japanese people feel they're pathetic.
The fact is that many people feel a strong uneasiness toward the Soka Gakkai. In this sense, you can say the establishment has succeeded.
But this opposition has failed to contain the organization. Ikeda has broadened the focus of Soka Gakkai to include education, peace activism, and intercultural exchange. He has also established a number of secular institutions to carry out these activities. Soka University, which employs the principles of Makiguchi's value-creating education theory, was built to concretize Toda's and Makiguchi's passion for educational reform. Minnan Concert Association was founded to promote understanding through cultural exchange. Its focus has been to detach culture from its elitist associations and make it accessible to a wider public. The impetus behind these efforts lies in the vision that has been inherited by the movement's successive leaders, a vision of ordinary people awakened to their own power and dignity.
The 20th century was a century of war. We must once again shed light on the human being. We must shift our emphasis back to the people. Otherwise, we stand to repeat the tragic mistakes of the past. This is our challenge in the 21st century. The revival of humanism. All people are absolutely equal and have the right to live in happiness. A people-centered perspective, a return to humanism. This is what is vital to create a future of peace.